All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Welcome to Talk Flock, our bi-weekly living room salon without the living room. I'm Jerry.
And I'm Anna. Every 2 weeks or so, we invite two friends from various fields to give brief but brilliant talks online on topics of their choosing.
These talks can be scripted or unscripted,
Lecture or performance.
about anything or nothing at all.
Our goal is to let people and ideas meet in this digital non-space.
And to seek new possibilities for encounter, wonder, serendipity, and engagement.
Tonight, our talkers are Kanika, Agrawal. I'm sorry, I didn't get your pronunciation beforehand, if you want to do it for me. Okay, and Pablo Chovil, and they'll each deliver 20-minute talks.
After which we'll open up the floor for Q&A and discussion.
And we do hope that the discussion gets lively. This is your digital space as much as it is ours.
So we'll listen, we'll talk, maybe we'll even disagree a little bit. We'll figure some things out.
Maybe spiral into deep, productive confusion together.
Fingers crossed.
So I know that we have all come from different places, but I would like to acknowledge that Jerry and I and Elena and Pablo and Kanika are speaking to you from the lands of the Lenape, Arapaho, Saura, and Sioran peoples. That means that the land that we are currently on belongs to those indigenous people. I just want to acknowledge and thank those people because we would not be here today without the genocide and the systemic exclusion of those indigenous peoples. So can we all take a breath together to offer acknowledgement and deep gratitude to these people and this land? So this acknowledgement is just the first step of many steps towards the lifelong fight to dismantle the legacy of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anna. So a couple of things before we begin. First, in lieu of charging admission, we're asking folks in attendance tonight to donate to a charity. And so Kanika has provided a list of charities that are related to immigration, which is related to what she is going to talk about. So I'm going to put those in the chat. And you'll see there's a list of highly rated charities related to migration. And then if you don't want to go through that list, she's highlighted the Texas Civil Rights Project. So I'm going to take a moment right now and click on that and bring it up in my browser. Excellent. And then when this is done, I'm going to put through my donation. So I hope you're doing the same. Second, please keep yourself muted unless you're the one talking. Even a little bit of noise can mess things up for everybody. Third, video is totally optional, so feel free to have it on, feel free to have it off. Also, feel free to move around. There's no need to like sit at your computer watching this perfectly still the whole time. You know, if I weren't hosting, I'd probably be cutting vegetables or something. Fifth, we are recording tonight's sessions for archival purposes, so feel free to turn off your video if that makes you uncomfortable. And if you have any problems with that, that's totally okay. Feel free to send me or Anna a chat or an email, and we can figure out something. And lastly, we have the chat box, which we've already put in the links there. So we invite discussion in the chat box as well as over the mic. Would say like keep it to a minimum while the talkers are giving their presentations, but while we're having open discussion, like there can totally be a parallel discussion there, and that's really great. Cool. So I'm going to pass it over to Anna now.
So welcome to the first edition of a new edition of Talk Flock. We are trying something new tonight. We thought that it would be really fun and interesting to decentralize the curating process for this. So we decided to ask previous Talk Flockers to curate some talkers tonight. So one of our speakers was curated by a previous talk flocker, Elena Light, and she'll speak in a second, while the other person was curated by Jerry. So we're trying out this new method in an attempt to reach beyond our immediate circle of friends and acquaintances and see how far we can go in these different fields. So without further ado, I will introduce Elena.
Hi, I'm Elena. I know a lot of you. Hello. Before I introduce Pablo, I want to make a plug for my talk flock, like the person I also did a talk flock with, George Emilio Sanchez, who is an amazing human, one of my good friends. We just so happened to be like on the same night and it was incredible. And he's doing, I know he's going to do a talk flock in the future, not sure the exact date yet, but with a bunch of Indigenous legal scholars and I think activists, but like people deep in Indigenous legal studies. And what he has a lot to say about that. And he's doing a master's in Indigenous legal studies right now. And anyways, I would really recommend tuning in because there's a whole swath of Native American history that many of us don't know, that George knows a lot about and these people are going to share. So look for that info in the future from Jerry and Anna's email list, which you will hopefully now be on. Otherwise, tonight, so one thing that I thought was so great about Talk Flock in the past was it's like really random people. Like it's a really, most, Anna and Jerry are both like performing arts people, but they're somehow finding amazingly diverse humans to invite to have these living room talks. And when they decided to try to decentralize their model and invite past Talk Flockers to curate, I was thinking to myself, okay, like who's like the farthest away from the arts person that I could invite and who would have something like really interesting to share about the world and also might like, yeah, bring a perspective that like my community doesn't normally hear. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, a person in my own family, Pablo Chovil, my brother-in-law. And so a brief intro on Pablo. Well, he's my brother-in-law, he's married to my twin sister, Kat, who's a diplomat. And Pablo is in the US Army. And when I first, encountered him, he was just out of college at George Washington University, where he had done ROTC, which is basically like an undergraduate Army training type of thing. I don't really know more beyond that. My understanding of Pablo's career is also like limited by my subjectivity. Like I don't know everything about what he does, and that's part of why I wanted to invite him here tonight. I've learned so much from him. Like he's described his experiences in training, doing ranger school, one of the most like challenging physical and mental exercises I've ever heard discussed. He's now, I know, a Green Beret, and he's working in the Special Forces. He speaks Arabic. He's been deployed to Iraq. I'm like listing off the various things I know about his Army career. But in some ways, like again, these limitations speak to my own limitations about like, I actually realized in meeting Pablo that I had a lot of biases and ignorance about the US Army, that I was initially incredibly critical and kind of like, I don't know, bashing it-ish, but like very subtly because I respect Pablo, but I was like thinking that in the back of my mind. And the more he shared his experiences, the more I started to gain a lot of respect for what he does and realize that also I was just really speaking from a place of ignorance. And so that's why I'm excited to hear him speak tonight. Like, even if I don't always agree with him, like we don't always agree, Kat and I don't always agree, but and Anna also, we all engage in this kind of dialogue coming from really different positions. But that's what I think is exciting. Like we can talk and we can understand these different perspectives and just to, like, let it be like that. Like this isn't necessarily something to debate, but something to consider in ourselves and in the world we inhabit. So yeah, I'm really excited. He's going to share some stories and some experiences with us. But yeah, Pablo, take it from there.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my name is Pablo, like Elena said, and I'm her brother-in-law. So Elena, thanks for that introduction. And Jerry and Anna, thank you very much for being so gracious with this awesome medium. I'm really excited to do this tonight with everyone here. I'd like to talk to you guys tonight about something that I'm really passionate about, and I have had some really long and interesting conversations with Anna and Elena and a lot of people here about as well. And that's the relationship, I guess, between the U.S. military and the citizens that it serves, specifically the citizens that might not see themselves as very in line with, with the military and what it does. I'm lucky enough to occupy a space that I think is pretty peculiar within my profession. So I'm a Green Beret. I work in special operations, which is, in my opinion, the most misunderstood and the most weirdly glamorized portion of the military. So it's a very insular little corner of the military, and what we do is special and kind of peculiar. Importantly, I'm also an immigrant. I am progressive. And generally speaking, I'm someone that I think has a little more access to a more diverse social circle than my peers might. So I think that I have an important responsibility to, whenever able, make the military and make special operations, again, this weird little corner, a little more accessible to people, to everyday people that, at the end of the day, like, we do things on behalf of, and they should understand a little bit about what it is that entails, the good and the bad. And I also think there's a healthy tension between what we call being a quiet professional, which is something that our profession values very fiercely, and again, communicating with people outside of our circle. Elena and I had a conversation yesterday, and she had to nudge me towards speaking a little bit more openly about myself, rather than broadly about the profession and about some experiences. So thank her for that. And we're going to get into a little more detail about, again, my particular trajectory, which I do think is interesting, but it's weird to be talking about myself in this context. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and talk about myself in this context, because I think it's a good way to begin. So I was born in Colombia, and my entire family is from there. My mom and dad are there in one of the corners in the video. We moved from Colombia to the United States when I was about 5 years old, and we moved here to escape the violence and instability that was rampant in Colombia in the 90s and the 80s and earlier, due to drug trafficking, paramilitary groups, lack of government legitimacy and lack of security. So we essentially ran. My father was kidnapped and later safely released. But essentially, we came to the States with very little. We arrived to the U.S., passing through Miami briefly, and then settled in Northern Virginia. So in Virginia, I grew up there in a pretty spectacular community full of diverse people and opportunities, and a really wonderful community that essentially built my desire to serve a community in some way. And really, I landed on the military by the time I was leaving high school for two reasons. One, my mom and dad always reminded me how lucky we were to be in the United States, to be given an opportunity to start over that a lot of families that we might have known didn't get in their lives. Most people didn't get that, and the fact that we did, luckily, was special, and we wanted to be thankful for that. I grew up wanting to serve that country that my parents had been so grateful for. And then the second reason I was intrigued by the military was that my dad was a history buff. Bottom line, he talked my ear off. He talked my brother's ear off. He would regale us over dinner, telling us stories about the Jedburghs, for example, which were the three-man teams that jumped into France before the Normandy invasion to organize the French resistance. Or he would talk about, espionage battles during the Cold War, or the intrigue of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And essentially the driving principle was that these were exciting, important, unique stories and adventures that people were having that had real consequence on the way the world kind of turned. And so bottom line, I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted to do so doing important, unique, exciting, adventurous work. And that describes I would say the vast majority of my peers and their reason for joining the military. They certainly are service oriented and they believe in serving something bigger than themselves, but they also want to do it in a way that's a little unique and exciting, frankly, right? It boils down to some pretty simple things. But anyway, so like Elena said, I did ROTC in college. So that's the program that essentially allows you to become an officer in the Army. And then after college, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia to attend infantry training and Ranger School. So leaving ROTC, I decided to join the infantry because it's the main combat branch of the Army. It's the place where you're most physically challenged and you're, in theory, you are going to be the ones that go and fight the enemy, whoever that is, right? It's the most intense and it's the most difficult branch, at least traditionally speaking. So I thought that was the most exciting place to be. I already knew I wanted to be in Green Beret, but that was a later step in my career, and we'll get to that. So after infantry training, I went to Ranger School, which Lenny mentioned, and which some of you may have heard of. So Ranger School is Ranger School has a well-earned reputation for being one of the hardest military training events in the world. You don't sleep more than 2 to 3 hours a night, sometimes less. You eat 2 meals a day, and you move really long distances carrying really heavy weight, I think 100, 120 pounds of equipment and gear on your back through the backcountry in Georgia and Florida while performing kind of combat exercises. And the reason for this is that the instructors have to prove that you're able to perform in combat under extremely stressful situations when your body is not at 100%. So you often don't get the chance to get a good night's sleep and a nice meal right before you get into a hard situation, on a deployment. You're tired, you've been walking a lot, you're hungry, you're cold, the weather's not great, and you still have to perform regardless. So the instructors have to simulate the stress of combat as best as they can without combat, and then expect you to perform day in and day out through that school. I went through that, and this is a good time to, I think, talk about Ranger School and the women that have been moving through Ranger School. I don't know how well people follow this, but it's a very large and controversial topic still in the military about gender roles in the military, in the Army, in combat arms in particular, which is the parts of the military that engage in ground combat. So the infantry, armor, so tankers, and special operations, so Green Berets and Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and things like that. Women have been graduating Ranger School and going to combat units with increasing regularity for the past few years, but I wouldn't say it's the norm yet. There's still a big fear of the cultural changes that opening up these units to women is going to bring. That being said, the best conversations with my peers that I've had about this topic have revolved around 2 things. One, the unique nature of the women that will go down this path, because there won't be a lot, at least initially. And 2, the additional insight that they're going to have in these organizations. So a lot of skeptics will focus on the physical rigors of combat as the biggest obstacle to women performing in these roles. The reality is that, one, they've already performed at Ranger School, they've already succeeded. You can't get through that school by cheating, and it's too long and it's too painful. And if you cheated one day, or if you were able to escape by one day, the second or third or fourth or 12th day will knock you out. And there's really no way to do that. Second, we already see that, there's female athletes in all sorts of disciplines that perform, there's no other way to say it, like extremely at an extremely high level that beats what any man or 99% of men can do in that particular sport. So there may not be a lot of women that are capable of performing at that level, but there also aren't really a lot of men that want to perform at that level anyway. So physicality has slowly been pushed out as a good reason to keep women out of it. And the second reason, and I think the more compelling reason, is about diversity, right? Diversity writ large. Combat and special operations units consider themselves pretty exclusive, and they're insular for a lot of reasons. Some of those are good reasons, and some of those aren't great reasons. Insularity engenders the teamwork and competitive attitude that we deem necessary for success in the field often. But a consequence of that is a lack of diversity. Still in special operations and in the infantry, the majority of people that work in those fields are white men. Now, as we move into a more egalitarian and inclusive society, because that's what we should always be striving towards, you're going to get more and more people from more diverse backgrounds involved in all sorts of jobs. Now, you're going to have more diverse people in those jobs, and that's important not only for diversity's sake, but because diversity helps problem solving, right? And there's been, there's lots of studies that show that a more diverse organization solves problems better, earns more money if they're a private organization, and generally speaking, brings more creative solutions to the table. So what that looks like right now, we don't know, but the reality is that the threats to the United States are more complicated than the Soviet Union standing army or the arms race that we had to deal with in the Cold War. It's very different now, and we don't we're not going to get into all that, but the reality is that we need smart people from kind of every background to help answer those questions. So moving into my experience with the Special Forces qualification course. So after I basically did a couple weeks of a tryout to get assessed to see if I could join and start training to become a Green Beret, there's about a 1.5 year long process to actually become a Green Beret. And in that course, I was constantly humbled by the people that I worked alongside. These are some of the smartest, most capable officers I've met during my time in the military and in my life, period. The reality, though, is that it's still largely white men that go through these courses. And then the diversity that we talk about a lot, that is increasing in private institutions and even government organizations, is harder to get in special operations for a couple reasons. One is the lack of role models, right? So already, right, the majority are white men. Family lineage is a large contributor to military service of any stripe. So without a lot of minorities that have served in these roles, there's not a lot of role models for young, Hispanic men or Black men or women to, get into these roles saying, yeah, I could do that. Now that's slowly changing with these, the women that are going through Ranger School, going to combat units. There are women that are in the qualification course to become Green Berets, and I know a couple of them, and they're every bit as phenomenal as you would expect them to be. And they have a, pretty tough road ahead of them to become kind of the trailblazers for that. But that's only gonna increase over time. A couple other kind of factors are poor recruiting. So the military just does a worse job recruiting in minority communities than it does in majority or rural communities, and that's something that I think they've been fighting against for a long time. But it's just it's a hard thing to do. And again, we be remiss to ignore the fact that there's, amongst minority communities, still a poor relationship to the government, and specifically the government organizations that have illegal use of force against them. And that's something that without fixing that, or without improving that relationship, in particular, African Americans will not want to join combat arms and will not want to join these organizations in any large number, in my opinion. Diversity is never going to outweigh the mission and the short-term necessities of completing these tasks, but long-term diversity is absolutely imperative to success in evolving situations, and it's something that I've seen kind of day in and day out here. Being a minority and being in these organizations, I've seen slowly how they change and how we've become better for it. So I'd like to move on now and essentially get into what special operations is and what special operations isn't, right? Because I think there's it's both, special operations is both lionized and negatively stigmatized. Hollywood paints the people in special operations as essentially, either, killers, the ex-Green Beret who was hired as an assassin, or as a rogue entity that does whatever it wants, which is, unsanctioned violence to go kill random people, right? And whatever. And then there's another portion of society that thinks that we can do no wrong, that we're lionized because all we're doing is protecting the nation, and we can do whatever we want because of that. And neither of those are, are accurate, right? The reality of what we do is much more complex, although the picture has been simplified because of Iraq and Afghanistan. So Iraq and Afghanistan, for the majority of the time that we've been there, special operations units and Green Berets have participated in a lot of what we call direct action. So those are raids against, enemy leadership, that we deem, important to kind of like take out, so we can debilitate the network of some particular insurgent organization that we're fighting against, right? That is the closest to what I think people envision when they talk about, special operations. The reality is that it's a network focused kind of endeavor, meaning that they're going to go after very, very important influencers who run, day-to-day operations, who manage, combat on behalf of that insurgency. And that, again, is like the Hollywood version. That also constitutes probably about 5 to 10% of what special operations do, if that, right? The majority of what we do is simple. It's partnership with allies, right? It's partnership with U.S. allies. And a lot of that falls under what we call, what we right now call deterrence, right? So the majority of special operations, that means going to nations that we have enduring or emergent relationships with and interacting with them. That can be as simple as, for example, my team will go to conduct training with them for a few months, or it can be as complex as the campaign in Mosul in 2017 to retake the city of Mosul that I was a part of. So, so I think my experience in Mosul was an excellent way to see what the day-to-day reality of special operations is, right? Because it's combat at the end of the day. It's working with your partner force, your partner nation that you're trying to help them on behalf of them and also on behalf of the U.S. government. So I wasn't in special operations at the time, but I worked with special operations there, and I moved in and out of different organizations there, and I got to see pretty clearly how that worked and how the day-to-day kind of in combat worked for that particular context. So the city of Mosul had been seized by ISIS in 2014, and the Iraqi military had essentially run away, leaving behind the entire civilian population and millions of dollars worth of military equipment, trucks, tanks, weapons, etc. Over the next several years, ISIS built up Mosul into a heavily fortified city, which the rejuvenated Iraqi military, alongside coalition partners, meaning us, Australians, Germans, Dutch, etc., right, a large coalition, they moved to retake beginning in kind of mid-2016. So when I arrived in early 2017, the Iraqis, alongside the coalition partners, had retaken the eastern half of the city, and Mosul split by the Tigris River. So they had taken the eastern half of the city and stopped at the river. And we participated in the campaign to recapture the western half. So once that got going, our day, essentially kind of day to day, our day began by getting up before the sun rose to prepare equipment, do our final checks for our day's planning. And that means, sitting down with your Iraqi counterpart, either with an interpreter, or if your Arabic's good enough, you speak Arabic with them, obviously, and you go over that plan for the day. You get them in your vehicles and you follow the column of Iraqi forces down the road into the city. The coalition forces set up camp at the Iraqis' command post, maybe about a half mile from where the front line of the fighting is going on. And then from there, we spent the entire day with the Iraqi commanders, watching and listening as the battle unfolded for that day, for that block, for that neighborhood, for that little bit of space that we're trying to recapture day by day. So as the Iraqis are fighting and dying, right, they're maneuvering through their city, trying to retake their city. And I mean their city, like the men that were fighting here, a lot of them were from Mosul. A lot of them had grown up in that area, had gone to military training, had been trained up by the U.S. and had come back to retake their city. As they're moving through their city, we are providing as support as responsively as possible. So that means intelligence, right? So we have a lot of obviously like intelligence capabilities. We have a lot of aerial assets, and then we have a lot of frankly like maintenance and support and kind of backside logistical capabilities that help them keep moving through kind of their operation. We are staying, far back enough to where we can see what's going on the battlefield, and we can help the Iraqi commander make decisions. And he's leading his men, and he's directing his subordinate units to move forward through the city. There's no doubt that the Iraqis bled for their own city. The Iraqis fought to retake their city, and we did everything we could to help. But I think that's a really good kind of example of what Special Operations Unit will do, which is work, again, with allies to achieve some interest overseas. That helps us, sure, and helps, the United States. But we have to help our partner allies and our partner nations. We have to help them be strong if we want to be strong, especially again in this world today where threats are not simple and we don't live in an easily decipherable world anymore. So I think that's pretty much my time. I'm happy to answer any questions later on or in the future if someone wants to get in touch with me. But yeah, I appreciate everyone taking the time here and listening. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. That was wonderful. It's always so illuminating to hear your personal experiences because I never hear them anywhere else. Thank you. So now we have time for any clarifying questions. So this just means like you would like a definition for something, nothing in depth. We'll have the full conversation after this second speaker. So does anyone have any clarifying questions?
I just want to ask Pablo, because I've been confused on this before. Could you distinguish, like you had to explain this to me in the past, could you explain the difference between special forces and special operations?
Yeah, that's an annoying thing that exists because the military is very complicated. So special operations essentially encompasses every branch's special operations unit, right? So the Navy has the Navy SEALs, right? The Army has Army Rangers, the Green Berets, which are Army Special Forces. Their official name is the Army Special Forces, but they are a type of Special Operations Forces. And that's why it's sort of interchangeable, sort of not. I think I use them pretty interchangeably during that. So different Special Operations Forces have different, essentially, mission sets and they exist for different reasons, right? Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, right? Those two are the exact same thing. So we exist primarily to work with partner nations. So, we train in multiple languages. We go to, work primarily. We will never essentially work alone. We always work with allies. But that's the distinction. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Does anybody else have any clarifying questions? Okay, you can also type them in the chat if you think of them later or hold them till the end. So now I will pass it to Jerry.
Thank you. And thank you, Pablo. That was really, really wonderful. And thank you, Elena, for bringing Pablo here. So it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Kanika Agrawal. Kanika is a poet, among other things, and I met Kanika at McDowell, an artist colony in New Hampshire back in January. And the thing, as I was sort of going today, like preparing to introduce you all to Kanika, the moment I kept thinking about was a night when we were walking to someone's studio, and it was like after dinner, and Kanika and I were just sort of talking about science, I think it was, because Kanika comes from a science background, and she may have to correct me on this, but I think biochemistry, and incorporates scientific thinking and scientific knowledge into her poetry and into her thinking and work. And you know, she is the superior poet, and so she will remember the words exactly. But I just remember her talking about, with such clarity and passion, about what it is to take something extremely technical or seemingly extremely technical, such as, I don't know, like X-ray chromatography. I don't even know what that is, but that's the word in my head right now. And to see beauty and truth in that. And that has, Kanika was explaining to me that that's been her relationship to science, is that it's not just like, oh, these are cool facts, or this is a path to knowledge, or this is a way to better the world. It's that it's really something extraordinary, and it can bring you in contact with the miracle and mystery of being. And I just so admired the way that she embodied that process and embodies it in her writing, which, like her, is fiercely intelligent, scrupulous, detailed, rigorous. While at McDowell, she had recently written some poems about sort of based on the structural recombination of DNA. I'm sure I'm getting that completely wrong, Kanika. But the fact that she would undertake that and put that into language and make something funny and interesting and beautiful and perplexing out of it, I think takes a kind of fierce curiosity. And so I hope we get to see some of that from Kanika tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Kanika.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. I promise not to live up to any of what Jerry just said about me. And thank you, Pablo, as well, for your very interesting perspective, which I think will lead to an interesting conversation and possibly some overlap and possibly some disagreement in the post-conversation. So behind me is an axolotl, which is an amphibian. And I have this little guy up here because I probably won't, I think I'll probably just end up talking and presenting perspectives from a variety of other works that I'm in engagement with right now, and probably won't get to actually reading any of my creative work. But the axolotl is an important figure in something that I've been working on, and that draws from a Julio Cortázar story called Axolotl. And the story begins, "There was a time when I thought a great deal about the axolotls. I went to see them at the aquarium at the Jardin des Plantes and stayed for hours watching them, observing their immobility, their faint movements. Now I am an axolotl." And so it's a really interesting story about subjectivity and an encounter with something that is both very alien and somehow still feeling a kinship with it, to the extent that there's almost this transfer of consciousness between the human viewer and one of the axolotls that the speaker is regularly viewing. And for me, that's also a way of thinking about this question of likeness and how we come to feel or not feel like someone else or like another being. And I connect that to a larger conversation about assimilation, about becoming like or making something like something else. And today I'm going to talk about it largely in the context of immigration, migration, though in my work more broadly, I'm trying to think about it in a broader context. What are other ways of things being like and not like, and how do we negotiate those differences? I'm going to put up some slides, just a couple of maps, and then I'm going to be reading some long quotes, and I thought it might be easier for some people to follow if I also had the text up there. So I'll have those up there as well. But before I do that, I'm just wondering if there is anybody here. You can raise your hand or type in the chat or whatever to answer this. I'm just wondering if there's anyone here who is not a US citizen. Or I know Pablo said.
My husband's, he's a resident, not a citizen yet. He will.
Okay, but he's a permanent resident?
Yet. Yes, and I am a citizen.
Okay, all right. And Pablo said that he's an immigrant, his family are immigrants. And it's just interesting for me to know whenever I'm doing a talk or having a conversation in a group of people about assimilation, immigration, etc., how many people have some familiarity with the immigration process, either because they've been through it themselves or because perhaps they work with immigrants, and how many people perhaps maybe read the news but don't necessarily have any personal sense of what going through the immigration process, or what are the many different ways of going through the immigration process and the variety of experiences that people go through. So I think, okay, and Harold Baker says that, oh, that's your parents, Anna, that your mom is a naturalized immigrant like the rest of her family. Okay, Biff goes by Biff, okay. All right, so I am going to share screen. So this is a map of showing immigrants in different countries, the immigrant population in different countries around the world, mid-29 estimates. And as we might expect, the larger immigrant populations are in what's known as the global north, which, if it's a term you're not familiar with, is a more recent term that tries to position differently what used to be thought of as the first world or developed countries. And so you have the global north and you have the global south, which again is not so much a geographic indicator as it is an indicator of economics and development, but trying to avoid some of the pitfalls of terms like third world countries or developing nations. So this map shows immigrants in various countries, the immigrant population, and then this map shows the emigrant population. And again, as expected, a lot of the emigration out of countries is happening in the global south, particularly parts of Asia, Africa, and South America, and Mexico. So just for a little context, my situation, my immigration situation, is that I have actually been in the US for over 2 decades, actually about 25 years, and am not a permanent resident, let alone a US citizen. And that is not by choice. That is due to the complications of the immigration process and the specific paths that are available to people. And those paths make it more difficult for certain groups of people as compared to other groups of people to acquire permanent residency and eventually citizenship. You know, and those reasons, there's a wide range of reasons immigration may happen faster or may take longer for someone, that include your country of origin, what kind of work you do, what your immigration history is, what your criminal history is, etc. I'm, in spite of the difficulties of being in this kind of immigration limbo for so long, I am documented, which gives me a lot of privilege, and you know, there are other things that also make the immigration experience in some ways easier for me, in spite of the difficulties such as my education, my fluency in English, etc. And in fact, when I met Jerry at McDowell, I was, during that time, waiting to transition into a different immigration status, still a temporary status, not permanent status, but one that I was hoping would give me a little bit more flexibility in terms of what I'm allowed to do in this country, what my options are here for work and other things. And so I was trying to transfer from a student status, which I had had doing my PhD, to O1 status. O1 is a visa category for people with extraordinary ability or achievement. And in my case, the subcategory was extraordinary ability in the arts. And the situation I was in was, well, either I get it, in which case I'm okay to be here for a few more years, and at that point I would have to try renewing the visa, or I don't get it, in which case I need to leave the country as quickly as possible in order to avoid being actively kicked out of the country, being deported, and in order to not jeopardize future chances of being able to return here at some point. Because if I were to overstay, then, you know, that would go on my record, and it would affect whether or not I would be able to obtain a visa to return to the US in the future. So it was this weird situation of being in this amazing community of wonderful artists, and at the same time sort of feeling like, you know, this could end tomorrow. I may have to pack up and rush out of here tomorrow if I find out that my visa application was not approved, and, you know, pack up my life of 25 years and flee the country. So what that's meant for me, oddly enough, is that my sense of being quote unquote assimilated into this country or feeling American has actually decreased over time, over the time that I've been in the US. I think there's often this assumption that the longer people are here, and especially if they're educated, and especially if they speak English, and especially if they have a certain level of cultural fluency, that assimilation is a given, if only they're willing. And my experience has been pretty contrary to that. In fact, because my dad was a diplomat for India, and So I didn't actually spend much of my childhood in India. I spent it in a lot of different countries and went to international schools. And a lot of my teachers and the student population was American. And so oddly enough, before I had ever come to the US, I had what was mostly considered a kind of neutral American accent. And right before I came to the US at the age of 15 with my parents, because my dad was posted here as a diplomat, I was in India, and everybody sort of assumed that I was, not my family because they knew, but other people I interacted with at school, for example, that I would be returning to the US because obviously I had already lived there in the past, because just look at how I spoke, and sort of what my cultural familiarity with America was. And so it has been this odd process of, you know, being mistaken for American before I ever came here. And then during my time here, gradually feeling like there's less and less and less of a chance that I can ever be American or feel American, which is an interesting trajectory. So I am going to read this abstract from a paper by academics at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University. This is an abstract from some research they've done. Let's see. Catalyst or crown, does naturalization promote the long-term social integration of immigrants? We study the impact of naturalization on the long-term social integration of immigrants into the host country society. Despite ongoing debates about citizenship policy, we lack reliable evidence that isolates the causal effect of naturalization from the non-random selection into naturalization. We exploit the quasi-random assignment of citizenship in Swiss municipalities that used referendums to decide on naturalization applications of immigrants. Comparing otherwise similar immigrants who narrowly won or lost their naturalization referendums, we find that receiving Swiss citizenship strongly improved long-term social integration. We also find that the integration returns to naturalization are larger for more marginalized immigrant groups and when naturalization occurs earlier, rather than later in the residency period. Overall, our findings support the policy paradigm arguing that naturalization is a catalyst for improving the social integration of immigrants, rather than merely the crown on the completed integration process. So this research and other research that Hein Mueller and people in his lab have done is particularly interesting because it challenges the idea that that people have to choose to integrate, choose to assimilate, be in a culture for a certain period of time before it makes sense to give them their documents, right? Before it makes sense to make them legal, or to give them residency, or to give them citizenship. And this challenges that notion by suggesting that actually the integration process, or the, if you want to call it the assimilation process, is made much easier and strengthened when that integration process through legal documents happens earlier rather than later in somebody's presence within a certain country. Okay. Oops. So in relationship to that and what's going on, has been going on for a long time at the southern US border, and particularly when it comes to child migrants, family separation, etc. And want us to keep in mind this issue of, not only who's allowed in, but how long before, even if they are not deported, even if they are permitted to stay, how long should the wait be before they are integrated into the US, before they are given the same opportunities and rights that citizens have? In Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, Valeria Luiselli writes about her experience of working through intake questionnaires with unaccompanied child migrants. The questions reveal far more about US attitudes and priorities and how they shape policy than they do about the scared, hesitant children who must provide answers they rarely have. And encountering those questions again and again, as Luiselli did, or other questions, often similar in intent, if not in phrasing, in the documents that every non-citizen approaching or entering or situated within these borders fills repeatedly with their facts. Eventually, one notices this country's simultaneous hold on and rejection of those of us who are, have been, will keep trying and failing to arrive, to stay, and perhaps to belong. Eventually, one considers the conditions of one's captivity. Luiselli writes, "I've had to ask so many children, why did you come to the United States? Sometimes I ask myself the same question. I don't have an answer yet. Before coming to the United States, I knew what others know, that the cruelty of its borders was only a thin crust, and that on the other side, a possible life was waiting. I understood sometime after that once you stay here long enough, you begin to remember the place where you originally came from, the way a backyard might look from a high window in the deep of winter. A skeleton of the world, a tract of abandonment, objects dead and obsolete. And once you're here, you're ready to give everything, or almost everything, to stay and play a part in the great theater of belonging. In the United States, to stay is an end in itself and not a means. To stay is the founding myth of this society, no matter the cost. The humiliations, the daily battles, you will give everything. You will convince yourself that it is only a matter of time before you can be yourself again in America, despite the added layers of its otherness already so well adhered to your skin. But perhaps you will never want to be your former self again. There are too many things that ground you to this new life." Why did you come to the United States? That's a question that I've been thinking a lot, more and more over time, and thinking about it in a way as if I were almost an actor doing different line readings, trying to determine, what's the right emphasis? How should I be asking this question? Why did you come to the United States? So, hey, what are your reasons? Do you have family here? Economic reasons? What are your reasons? Why did you come to the United States? That's almost like, maybe you haven't thought this through enough, or even kind of kicking yourself, saying, why did I do that? I've been here all this time, and initially it was almost a given that I would come here, and now after all this time, it's like, hang on a second, maybe you need to think about that again. Why did you come to the United States? That's when you start to think about your privileges, the opportunities you've had. Maybe given that there are far more people who would like to come here than actually get to come here. Perhaps you have taken somebody else's spot, right? Perhaps you haven't fulfilled the promise that was offered to you through the United States, and somebody else should have had that opportunity. And then why did you come to the United States, right? Why here and why not somewhere else? Maybe things would have been easier somewhere else. Maybe you would already have had your papers somewhere else. Maybe you would have felt more of a sense of belonging somewhere else. Why here? So something that I sort of just, as a child and going back to having had so many American teachers and friends, took for granted that, well, eventually I'll go to school in the United States and stay there, has now become a question that I'm thinking about much more and in much more complex ways. And of course, this is a question, why did you come to the US? Why did you come here? That's asked of many people in different situations for different reasons, right? Sometimes, in the case of the questionnaire that Louiselli was helping the children fill out, why did you come to the United States, was a question to determine whether or not the children had been in danger in their home countries. And the only right answer to give was to detail just how much violence and prejudice specifically defined within certain categories they had been subject to back home, and so they would deserve to stay here as refugees or asylees. But of course, sometimes the question is asked in an accusatory manner. Why did you come here? How dare you come here, in other words, right? So these are two quotes from Suketu Mehta's This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. Mehta is an Indian American journalist and a professor of journalism at NYU. This first quote is how he begins his book. One day in the 1980s, my maternal grandfather was sitting in a park in suburban London. An elderly British man came up to him and wagged a finger in his face. "Why are you here?" the man demanded. "Why are you in my country?" "Because we are the creditors," responded my grandfather, who was born in India, worked all his life in colonial Kenya, and was now retired in London. "You took all our wealth, our diamonds. Now we have come to collect. We are here," my grandfather was saying, "because you were there." And a later quote, and I'll wrap up after this because I'm realizing I've gone over time. "If the rich countries don't want the poor countries to migrate, then there's another solution. Pay them what they're owed. Pay the costs of colonialism, of the wars you imposed on them, of the inequality you've built into the world order, and the carbon you've put into the atmosphere. Settle the account, and the creditors will have no reason to come to your house. Reparations or migration, or migration, choose." So I'll just stop there with that idea of reparations or migrations, choose. As always, I realize that I've prepared for a talk that's twice as long as the amount of time I actually have. So I'll just end there, and then if there are other things I can pull from what I prepared in response to questions or the larger conversation, I'll do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kanika. I'm going to end your screen share here. Give it up for Kanika.
With banana cookies with cream cheese.
So at this point, we're going to have a little discussion among the four of us, and then very quickly we'll open it up to everybody else. Anna, do you have a question to start us out with, or would you like me to get started?
I guess I feel like my question is such a big question. Why don't you start, Jerry, and then I'll see if I can narrow it down.
Yeah, I guess to start with Pablo, so you talked a lot about the incorporation of women and people who aren't white into the military and into, in particular, like high-ranking or positions of command in the military, and kind of what at least sounds to me like the slow trickle of that happening. And I guess I wonder what your sense is from within the military of how trans and gender nonconforming people fit into that as well. And I guess my question kind of includes not only like what is ordered by the executive branch, but also kind of how the culture of the military is prepared to allow difference, essentially, which is part of what you're talking about. And I guess that like sort of dovetailed in with that question is the question of like, to what extent does the culture of what it feels like to be in the Army, like to what extent is that adaptable to make it a more inclusive place?
Yeah, that's also a huge question. The short answer is that there's a couple different components, right? So there's the, I guess, like functional reality of it, and then there's the cultural component. I'll speak to the functional reality first. I think non-binary people already serve in the military in different capacities. They have for some time, and the problem with their service is that it's constantly under threat, right? Obviously, this administration, but it's not the first time that it's been put, that their right to serve their nation has been put under threat. And until there is a status quo change in the culture, I don't think the military is going to get to a point where it receives non-binary people in a way that's accepting enough in the way that these people deserve. That's not an answer that's satisfying, right? It's not the right answer, but the reality is that Army culture, it's still. I speak to the Army specifically because the Army is what I'm in, and I don't know the Air Force and the Navy, but specifically the Army. Generally speaking, it's mostly middle class. Generally speaking, it trends not super inconsistently along demographic line, like the demographic lines that are shared by the country, although there's obviously gaps there. But the reality is that it's still culturally a little bit more conservative than the country as a whole, and then the progressive future that I think, most of us here want to see. And that's unfortunately likely not going to change for some time, because that change doesn't happen in the military. That change happens as the status quo and the Overton window kind of shifts in society, and we become more accepting of non-binary folks in places outside of urban progressive centers, right? And that's a matter of education. That's a matter of honestly, talks like this is it's a matter of like showing people that folks generally just want to like be loved and do good things, whatever that may be defined for them. That's just a slow process, and the Army is a massive entity, and it moves slowly. Now, it also is a generally socially the Army was one of the first. The military is one of the first organizations to integrate African Americans. The Army was one of the first government organizations to integrate women into different roles. So it's a weird paradox where like culturally there's a lot of pushback, and then all of a sudden like it happens and everyone can kind of complain about it for a little bit until they realize that realistically there was no there was no operational detriment to including these people, right? It was the same thing with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? People thought that when you allow gays and lesbians to serve in the military, that unit cohesion was going to be affected detrimentally, that people were going to be unable to focus, et cetera, right? Like the same things that you hear normally. And guess what? It was repealed and people complained about it for 25 minutes, and then then people got over it. And I think at this point, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is, I think, a pretty good example, because at this point, if people are extremely homophobic, they hide it better than I think they did in the past. Obviously, that's not a good or perfect answer, but that's just, again, the reality of what that is. And that's better than it was yesterday, and tomorrow it'll be better. And at this point, people care far less about, who you love than about if you can do the job. That I don't think that extends to non-binary people currently in the same way that it does to, gays and lesbians. But I think it's trending in that direction. It's just slow, to be honest. I hope that was a decent enough answer.
Thank you. That was great. I have a follow-up question to that, but I also have a question for Kanika, excuse me. So I'm going to ask Kanika the question, and then hopefully I'll have time for my follow-up for Pablo later. Kanika, when you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about a lot of things, and it was really beautiful, so thank you. And I really love this book, The Borderlands by Gloria Anzaldúa. And it's a lot about identities that exist in two places, or in multiple places, or between place. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about like your identity as someone who's not quite here, or maybe you're here and other places, and how that kind of affects your personal identity.
Yeah, as soon as you started asking that question, I thought of this term that Suketu Mehta uses, which I think is an interesting term that I don't really identify with, but that I think offers one model, which is the term interlocals, which is people who locate themselves within specific communities in very different spaces. So for him, he says, my communities, the communities that I travel between are, particular area, a part of New York and a particular part of Bombay, right? And I don't think of myself in these sort of large, broad terms of Indian or American, or even Mumbaiite or New Yorker, but rather as sort of grounded in these two particular communities and having mobility and flexibility to grow across them. Now, of course, that doesn't work for a lot of people, for the majority of migrants, in fact, because there has to be a certain level of, a pretty high level of privilege in terms of finances, in terms of documentation, in terms even of just sort of how safe or not you are physically moving between those communities. So I think that can be a kind of way to think about identity that can keep you grounded in a particular community rather than feeling very diffuse. But unfortunately, it doesn't work for everyone. And I would say I'm sort of, I have the kind of background, that somebody like Mehta has that could put me in that category. But because I don't have the kinds of papers that Mehta has, it makes it far more difficult to have that level of mobility, right? Mehta is a citizen of the US. So he came here at 14, I came here at 15, though he came here, you know, about 15 years earlier than I did. But he, you know, has been a citizen for a long time. And just the simple fact of having a US passport means you have a lot more mobility in the world than you have with an Indian passport or a passport for many other South Asian, Southeast Asian, African, South American countries. And then there's this additional problem of, even when you have documents, of there always being this risk when you are not a citizen or even a permanent resident of, you know, going back home, if that's how you think of it, and being denied a visa to return. And that can happen for all kinds of reasons, right? It can happen because policies change often, especially under this administration, but not just under this administration, you know, at the drop of a hat. That very quickly you may go from thinking, oh, I'll just pop over to India, you know, for a couple of weeks for a cousin's wedding and then come right back to my husband who's over here, to being stuck in India for months because of policy, or longer because the policy has changed and now you can't, or because there's a pandemic and now you can't get into the visa office to come back, right? Or because you have some kind of minor unintentional immigration violation, or some, you know, I'm talking about very minor things, right? But that can end up sort of going on your record in a way where a single visa officer can make the decision that no, you are not allowed to return to the US. So I think how somebody establishes layered identities, multiple identities is very much dictated by many things, but also by the very practical matter of what passport do you have, what visa do you have, etc.
Thank you. That's great. Elena, did you have a question also?
I mean, I have a question that's like, both of your talks are making me think about, how can I phrase this to both of you? Like, I'm really struck. Okay, Pablo and I were talking the other night about how, like, if the people in the military become more diverse, and if like that, and are steeped in practices that are like kind of different than what is historically associated with the military, like not the descendants of settler colonizers, then the military, it's already becoming much more like diplomacy. Like the military works very much, he was describing a lot of the ways that what he did in Iraq was much more like diplomatic relations, or that's what like special operations ultimately does in a lot of ways. So, and I'm thinking also about how like what you've described, Kanika, which is, yeah, this question of naturalization. And in both instances, I'm thinking about like the beingness of like it's like an ontological question. Like if the military is composed of people who are potentially shifting the practices of the military, then is it still the military? Or is it still an armed force? Like if it's not using armed force that often, is it still an armed force? And like the same question applies to what it means like to be American. Like if many more people are becoming naturalized, but I mean, it's sort of it's an idealistic question, I suppose. Like if the process of naturalization happened earlier in what you described, Kanika, and that allows people to, I mean, ideally, like integrate in a way that doesn't require total assimilation and total loss of their historic, like their cultural identity, then suddenly what it means to be American, like then there is not a fixed there's not a fixed meaning of Americanness. And I guess my question is like, how do you see, yeah, these fixed, how do you see these, what I'm naming is like the military and like the American citizen. How do you see these like fixed identities changing? Or what you guys are both talking about, how might that disrupt these stable identities? What do you see them becoming?
Pablo, you want to go ahead?
Sure. And I have a follow-up question for you, Kanika. Hopefully I'll wrap around to it. So yeah, Lenny, good question. So I think the simplest way to kind of attack that is that as an institution becomes more like the people that it represents, it should more accurately reflect the desires of those people, right? So historically speaking, the military has been, right, mostly white, mostly men. That has been changing in the past, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades, right? So slowly, again, it's a slow-moving institution, and defense is not something that America has historically wanted to be cavalier with in the sense that I think you're talking about. But it moves slowly, and as demographics shift, people come into positions of power and influence that can change how we prioritize certain decisions. Sorry, this is my cat. I wanted to get in on it. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that I think ties into what Kanika was talking about is I think there's a relationship between the government and the governed that is a little bit askew. That it is not the citizens' responsibility to blindly trust that what the government is doing is good for, them. That's not the way this works, right? It's the government, it's whatever institution exists, it's the institution's responsibility to demonstrate to, the people they represent every day that they are, worthy of their continued support, that they are doing the work that is required for that population. So as attitudes about the use of force, right? As attitudes about how we interact with other nations and how we interact with other people, as attitudes about that change in the United States, the military has to, change its stripes. The military is not full of people that all they want to do is go invade countries, right? Like that's not what the military wants to do, right? They listen to, representative leadership, and they do what they decide. So again, as these demographics and as the Overton window again changes to be more accepting of a better way of thinking about these things, answers become a little bit different and ideally a little bit better. Now, how that wraps into what Kanika was talking about, and I'd like to ask you a question, Kanika. It's acknowledged in essentially I don't know, I don't want to say academic circles. It's widely acknowledged that immigration is a net positive for the United States, right? Immigrants come here and they do what they need to assimilate. They, start businesses. They do all these things that whether it's measurable or immeasurable, they help this country, right? And yet immigration seems to be this kind of unreachable goal for so many people. And then when people show up, like you very eloquently talked about, citizenship, naturalization is the light at the end of the tunnel that exists. And when we get to that light, you're going to be perfect and your life is going to be great. And you're going to be a member of this incredible polity that we've built here that's perfect, right? How do we think about it differently to where the government sees all these people that can provide so much for the well-being of people inside this country? How do we change that to where people here, not just the government but people writ large, see immigrants as net positive, whether or not they're naturalized, right? Because there's a lot of again, net positives that come from just the fact that they're here, the fact that they're interacting in this space, the fact that it's not the same people that we're seeing every day. How does that mentality shift happen, in your opinion?
Okay, so Elena's question, Pablo's question, two very big, complex questions. And if I had the answers, I could probably make a lot of money off of that, and then get an entrepreneur's visa and get my permanent residency much faster. So obviously I don't have the answers, but I do have some thoughts. I think, well, you know, one issue is that it's not as if, well, the government's trying really hard to convince people that immigration is cool and helpful, but people just aren't getting it, right? So it's not just a question of how do we help government get this message across to the people better. The government often, and especially right now, is, or I should say that the administration right now, not the government as a whole, is trying very hard, in fact, to send the message that immigrants, migrants, refugees, asylees, all of these people are ruining your country, right? So that there is active messaging counter to what you're talking about, Pablo, and nationalist riling up of hatred against certain groups. And then that made me think of this talk by the philosopher Jason Stanley, who's the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, that I just watched a little while ago. And one of the things he says is, we're not going to be able to fight the problematic forces in our country unless we recognize them as native born, right? So that it's not the case that the problems of immigration, migration, which themselves are connected to these larger problems identified by Suketu Mehta, which are colonialism, corporate colonialism, war, and climate change, right? So it's like, well, why is all that migration happening in the first place, right? But then once it is happening, then it's not the case that whatever problems you're experiencing in your country are now being brought in by all of these people coming from outside, right? Certainly there are challenges to having any large number of people coming into a society that where they may not be as familiar with the language or culture, etc. But as you yourself said, Pablo, there is a ton of research showing that immigration is in so many ways positive, right? And not purely in economic terms, but also in cultural terms, right? So, and another thing that Stanley says is, I mean, because his book is about fascism, fascism is about purity. So this idea that what's being changed is this existing purity of American culture, or white American culture, the dominant culture, right? And that's really what's made America great in the world. And once that's diluted, well, that's the end for us. But one, America never was pure, whatever that might mean, right? And whatever whiteness as purity it has sort of acquired as an identity is sort of founded on genocide, enslavement, etc., of people of color. So I think first you have to get rid of the notion that there is any kind of purity to be achieved. And then I think the idea of what assimilation is also has to be radically rethought, so that assimilation is not this process. As I was thinking through a lot of these things, both for my work and this conversation, a term that came to my mind was that assimilation is actually often this kind of part of a phagocytosis, right? So there I'm adapting the term phagocytosis into phagocytosis, which is like almost this psychotic devouring of things, right? Which is also what has driven colonialism, corporate colonialism, war, and climate change. This just consume, devour. right? And ideally, from the perspective of people who are in support of those things, that when you assimilate a certain group of peoples, that essentially you neutralize them, right? Or you extract from them everything that's useful to the dominant culture. And then, and then that's that. That there isn't this kind of inter process of assimilating, of like, we move into a sense of mutual likeness or mutual belonging, figuring out how to be in relationship with each other. But we eat you, right? We take from you what we can, and possibly even recruit you into the oppression of other people we have not yet assimilated, right? So not just, okay, we'll make you a part of our dominant culture, but once you become a part of our dominant culture, you do have to agree, albeit tacitly, to now be against the other people we'll be against. Is there a question?
We're all just sitting, Kanika, you just blew our collective minds.
If we're moving into the general discussion, I do have a question. Okay. And thank you to both speakers. It was both very interesting. And thank you, Kanika, for that quote from Suketu Mehta. I wrote it down. That it's a very good expression of an important idea. But I have a very selfish question for Pablo, because I have a film discussion tomorrow night, and I would love to have his opinion on Da 5 Bloods. I hope you've seen it. It's if you haven't, it's a great film that touches on all these issues of race and the status of minorities in relation to the experience of people serving in the military and serving in war. So have you seen it?
I haven't, and now I feel awful that I haven't, because it sounds like the perfect film for me to watch.
Yeah.
But now I need to ask you where I can find it, because now I need to watch it.
It's on Netflix.
Perfect. I'm gonna watch it tonight.
It's on Netflix.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Pablo, can I ask you a question? You talked about, your reasons for joining and sort of clearing up some misconceptions. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether over the course of time there have been any reservations that have come up, or questions that have come up for you about how you do the work you do, what interests you're serving, and then also whether you feel like the kinds of questions you may have are questions that you see being asked or pondered by other people in your community.
Yeah, short answer, constantly, all the time. I think most of my peers do, to varying degrees, ask the same questions. I don't think they get as deep as certainly, I think the folks on this discussion here do. Because I know I don't often, but I do think about, to your point, like what interests, we're serving at the end of the day. I don't have an answer that I think like I would feel great explaining to you. So part of the way I see it is, again, so I'm Colombian. A very big part of my identity is that, I'm Colombian, and I feel very strongly, Colombian, and like that part of me and that part of the culture and my identity is still very strongly kind of intertwined with that country and the people there and the music and the food and everything. Colombia was in the midst of some of the most violent internal conflict, civil war, insurgency, that whatever you want to call it, that the 20th century saw, basically from 1950 to roughly like 2004, 2005, right? And the reason it changed, one of the reasons it changed, I don't want to say the reason because there's obviously a lot of things, but from my kind of perspective, one of the reasons it changed was an initiative called Plan Colombia. And it was essentially a massive US investment in the Colombian economy, the Colombian defense infrastructure, that allowed the Colombian, essentially like the Colombian military and law enforcement to essentially tamp down this insurgency to the point where, you know, a couple years ago, the FARC essentially was willing to enter into actual like government, you know, I guess like they entered into the government, right? So they are now part of the government that runs Colombia. And I don't know the full details of like how it, you know, how it runs right now, because I don't keep up with it. But again, as you know, as I'm growing up, I'm seeing that, and for me, that was an example of like, I totally agree with the reality that there's complexity involved in how the United States kind of uses its power and influence overseas, and there are a lot of less than savory things that the United States has done overseas. I have no argument against that point, and I have no real defense of that. But I do see a lot of what good can come out of that. And so I think moving forward, I remember, you know, Plan Colombia really is like an indicator of what can happen when something goes right. And it wasn't perfect, and there's obviously still violence in Colombia, and probably a part of that is due to, I don't know, like the arms that, you know, the United States sold to the Colombian military. I don't deny that at all. It's far from a perfect solution, but it was a solution that helped improve the country. And then like I guess like the longer term question, and my wife and I talk about this all the time because she, you know, like Elena said, she's a diplomat, she works at the State Department, and she deals with a lot of these same topics. And she, you know, she and her peers also think very deeply about the responsible use of American power, right? And if there is such thing as that, and if there is, like we've been talking about tonight, a way to redefine that or to reorient that in a more productive direction. Again, like there are way more questions than answers, and if I had the answers, I would probably be, you know, like a general or something right now, you know. But all I can say is that, again, the more people that I don't want to say like the more people like me that are very smart and capable, no, like, but the more people like me that think deeply about these things and maybe don't jump to the easiest of conclusions, the more of us that are in positions of action or of influence in these places that have traditionally been, again, power centers for some of the less attractive parts of you know, American colonialism and American adventurism abroad, the better, because we start, again, reorienting our priorities towards things that, you know, might matter to us a little more in the future. I hope that's a relatively decent answer. Again, there's no short-term solution to that, though. And yes, daily is how often I have these questions and these conversations with my, you know, my closest friends and people that think about this stuff a lot.
Thank you. I just want to be wary of our time, and everyone's been so generous to share space with us. So I wanted to thank you guys for being so vulnerable and intimate with us, both of you. This has been a really special talk flock for that. I feel like I've seen little windows into both of your souls, and that's a real joy. So I know that we didn't get to open the discussion up too much to the rest of the group, and I apologize for that. So I invite everyone to write in the chat maybe a comment or a word about what you're feeling or thinking, or a question, so that we can have those. And also we will put in again the donation plugs. so that you guys can ruminate on where to put your money, and also we can gather the rest of your thoughts on these two very interesting and illuminating conversations. Also, you guys did such great communicating. All right, we've got lots of thoughts. And I'll write a word.
That's such a good question, Katie.
Yeah, it is. So once again, thank you guys for coming. We can have a sort of soft close. So if people want to continue to converse, you're welcome. If not, thank you guys so much again for coming. And we have another talk flock coming, but do we know the date, Jerry?
I think we're shooting for the 3 weeks from now, but we're not yet clear. And that next one will be the one that George is curating. So we really hope you can join us. I think it's going to be really a special night.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, like, if anybody has any questions or comments that they, you know, desperately need to talk about, I'm happy to stick around for a little longer, because I know, because it can be kind of disconcerting to have a lot of issues raised and then not have some kind of resolution to that. So yeah, if anybody does want to talk a bit more, I can stick around.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Likewise, I'm more than happy to stick around. So.
Okay, great.
Kanika, I wanted to ask you a question about, you mentioned Julio Cortázar, and I did read many years ago something that he wrote, and I wanted to ask you about the book where he mentions the kind of creatures that I had never heard about them, so I just wanted to ask you the name of that book.
It's a short story, so you can find it in collections of his short fiction. It's actually a pretty short story called Axolotl. Yeah. So if you just pick up a collection of his short fiction, actually you can you can probably even just Google it and find it online, because it is such a popular story of his.
Okay. Can you send us how to spell, because I actually looked for it and I couldn't.
Yeah, I will type it in chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And thank you very much. It was super interesting, and you guys did a wonderful job of linking those two subjects, which at the beginning were very, very far apart. So thank you.
Well, I have a question. I just wanted to ask, like, a kind of like fantasy imaginary exercise. If Pablo, this is for you, but also could be extended to anyone. Like, what do you think that the military would look like if it was more diverse? Like, how do you think it would change? What would change? I know you can't know for sure. I'm just asking you to imagine.
No, that's a really good question. I think already there exists a so first, like, diversity for diversity's sake isn't the way the military has generally done things, but the more diverse the military is, the more it recognizes that more diversity is better, you know? So like diversity begets diversity, and it will just allow more people into it. So that's one thing. As far as like kind of like big picture stuff, like what we see us doing, I think, so right now the military is you know, the instrument of the state that essentially is like the legal use of violence against enemies, whatever that means, right? I think that changes the more and more assimilation, right, happens, not one way or not another way, but the more, I guess, the less the military represents just one group of people, the less that one group of people, and Kanika mentioned it before, that like, you know, there's you know, the way like political discourse on, let's say, the right exists right now, exists in like a pretty like ramped up, very anti everything sort of atmosphere, to where that, I would never say that that's like where the military exists, but there's certainly people in the military that lean closer to that than what we're talking about here, right? But as those people become the minority, it becomes less tenable to speak so easily about violence being the first option, right? And in a you know, in a future world, there exists a world somewhere, right? There exists a version of the world somewhere where like violence isn't required, and that's not a thing that we need to do because it's just not necessary, right? But until then, like that kind of, that movement away from like easy violence because these people are not like us for all these reasons, whatever, and therefore like, let's just do that because this is how we feel safe, right? Which is like the historic easy way to define like colonial, you know, colonial violence against people in a lot of ways, right? They're not like us, and this is the easy way to influence, right? So this is what's going to happen, right? The closer and closer we get to or the more diverse we get, and the further away we get from like a homogenous, really government, right, but military in particular, right, the easier it is to envision a world where like that's not the first solution, right? Like that's not, like competition can exist without use of force being like the option on the table. And I will say, right, like even right now, like like the use of force is never the first option. It just often ends up being the option that is the most publicized, the most broadcast. But there's a lot of other things that go on, you know, in that space.
I feel like that leads into a question I have for you, Kanika, and maybe if you don't mind, is like thinking about what you're, the way you're talking about assimilation and migration and like this kind of phagopsychotic model of assimilation, which feels extremely related to what Pablo was talking about. I guess I'm wondering if you can like bring into the room other models of assimilation, whether these are from like the political realm or from like the realm of biology or like plant or animal behavior or chemical behavior. Like what are other versions of assimilation? Yeah, what are other versions of assimilation? And I guess if you know, for bonus points, if you can relate that to what Pablo is saying about the military assimilating, and kind of, it sounds like what Pablo is saying is like, if we are more like those who we think we are the enemy, there is less antagonism.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I can talk about other ways in which I'm trying to think about how to experience likeness to something or someone else, you know, rather than models of assimilation coming out of other disciplines, but also in to extend what Pablo was saying, you know, I think this issue of diversity in the ranks is a broad systemic problem, right? That we have to think about. I mean, for me in my discipline, I'm thinking about it in terms of what it means for academia, what it means for publishing, right? And in these areas too, although often the stakes may not seem as high as they might in the military, it's not simply a matter of saying, all right, we would like a more diverse group of people, so can we have a more diverse group of applicants for these positions, or can we have a more diverse group of writers submitting to be published? because one, who are the people making those decisions, right? About who gets to become part of the institution. So again, in terms of thinking about diversity in the military too, right? How much of that diversity exists in amongst the people who are making the larger decisions about, you know, where we go and what we do there versus the sort of bodies that are put on the line. And that you have to expect and hope and work towards a transformation of the institution through that diversity, not just sort of hope that, well, we'll bring these new people in and then things will somehow magically change for the better, right? Without us actively having to do anything, or even if we are open to transformation, the diverse people coming in have to do all of that work. Pablo, did you have something to?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Like, you're so right. And there's a saying that I hear all the time at work, and it's that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So every time that some senior officer, you know, puts out a memo talking about how important diversity is and how, you know, we must, you know, integrate our force with more, you know, minorities and women, and it's, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because this is going to make us a more whatever, right? Like, they'll put out this memo and they'll say like, yep, this is great. Like, we're going to change the world through this, you know, important initiative that we just built, and everyone's going to follow it. And obviously, like, people that disagree with that look at that memo and they say, no, like, this, whatever, like, I don't care about this. This isn't a priority. This isn't something that matters. And so it's interesting, like, to think about, like, again, the difference between like the intention and then the action of diversifying, right? There's a difference between saying, I wish we were more diverse, that'd be cool, and the action of doing that, right? In any circle, right? And it changes how, you know, depending on where you are, like, it's harder or easier to diversify, but like, that's a verb. Like, you have to do that. It's not just, it doesn't just happen because more people, you know, just appear, right? And that's something, again, like, something people struggle with a lot to try and figure out how to do, but it's not a simple thing.
This actually makes me think of the movie The Big Sick, and there's this part where the father of the woman, you know, is talking to the Kumail Nanjiani character and brings up 9/11, right? And that character is sort of like, yes, you know, of course it was terrible, and then makes the joke, we lost some of our best people, meaning, you know, like the terrorists,
Sure.
right? And of course, you know, her parents look horrified for a second, and he's like, oh, you know, I'm just joking. But what that also makes me think about is that if you don't have any people making the decisions, carrying out operations, who can actually look at people from Saudi Arabia or other parts of North Africa and West Asia and say, these people look like my people. These people look like my father, my brother, et cetera, et cetera. You know, then it's sort of much easier to have this kind of idea of this distant monolithic enemy, and everybody in that group is sort of interchangeable and can be eliminated or thought of as collateral damage.
100% agree. 1000% agree, yeah.
And Jerry, really quickly, because I've been talking so much, just in terms of like one way that I find it helpful to think about, you know, what it is to be in relationship and in belonging to other beings, does go back to thinking beyond the human, you know, and drawing from biology to think about, you know, on the one hand, of course, there are so many differences between us and other creatures. On the other hand, there are lengths of DNA and behaviors and body structures and so on that are conserved over, between species that you would never expect. And that one of the reasons we can use such a wide range of species as model organisms is because there are all of these connections between species, right? So we can study the axolotl or, C. elegans or Drosophila or whatever, and through that learn so much, not just about those creatures, but about ourselves. And it becomes a different way of thinking about our connections to other people and to non-human beings in the world, which I think can be one way of changing how we think about likeness, belongingness to other beings, and perhaps also how we, as a result, then think about things like climate change. I mean, I think all, migration, climate change, rise of right-wing nationalism, all of these things are so intimately connected.
Quick point on climate change. I think that it's obviously a horrendous thing, and something like it's pretty much like the most important thing that is happening right now and kind of happening in the longer term. The military is slowly getting to the point where it looks at climate change as this existential threat to American security, which in my opinion is a really good thing, because it presents this opportunity for the Department of Defense to look at itself as the Department of Defense, and not just like necessarily like the Department of defending Americans against people that aren't Americans that want to kill Americans, right? It becomes like, okay, what can we do, right, as an entity, organizationally and like actively to combat climate change, right? And they're still in like the super early stages of that, and it doesn't exist in a kind of strong way yet, but it's like the beginning of, again, like looking at problems like this that aren't like, okay, like 9/11 happened and we can point to the 25 guys that did it, and these people are mostly from Saudi Arabia and we hate Saudi Arabia now and that's it, right? It becomes this like broader perspective, like how can we like obviously defend ourselves, but against just things that are bad, like things that hurt Americans that aren't necessarily like, other people, right? Anyways, yeah, it was just, you mentioned that, and I thought it was. I have one question for Kanika, if you have the time. I know it's getting late, but there's a quote that you mentioned. I think it was the Valeria Luiselli. Mm-hmm. Something about the great theater of belonging, right? So there being a notion like there's your real identity and there's a fake identity, and then somewhere in between is like what you use day to day and how you might have to code switch or might have to like inhabit one, depending on where you go. You talked a lot about like how you felt less assimilated, right, as time's gone on. At this point, how comfortable do you feel in like, is there a fake identity that you think you have? Is there like an identity that you like put on for certain, for certain, in certain environments and for certain people? Like I know I think about that a lot, because I definitely do, and I have an identity that I put on at work because because I have to seem a little bit less, like for example, like politically progressive, right? Like I'm pretty progressive, and I have to like turn that down because work is very apolitical, right? But I'm kind of curious how like you think about that particular quote, and then like again like identities as immigrants, and like your story is obviously a little more complex than just being an immigrant. But how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think with what Luiselli is saying, and just how I've been thinking about it in terms of my own experience and the experiences of other people I know, it's not so much that there is the sharp division between a fake identity and a real identity, right? But that there are just so many layers of identity to negotiate, and that yeah, sure there's, you know, there's code switching that happens, but that's like, I don't have an issue with code switching, and in fact I think code switching is kind of wonderful, you know. And coming from a country where people often speak multiple languages, and there's sort of lots of intersections of language and community, it's an expectation that there will be code switching. I think it's more about what reasons you're code switching for, and what are the circumstances in which you're expected to perform identity in a certain way, you know. So in which you're expected to, you know, on the one hand, there's a version of sort of assimilation, which, as I was saying, is a kind of like neutralization or extraction, you know, where it's like, well, you know, there may be some aspects of your history, culture, identity that we like, that are useful to us, and we'll take that and we'll adapt that, and now you can continue to practice those in the ways that we've adapted them, right? But then there's also a version, and maybe these aren't, you know, maybe these are actually quite interrelated, where, especially with certain types of progressives, there's this expectation that you will always perform your ethnic identity to an extreme degree, or to a kind of like, you know, turn it into a kind of theatrical performance almost, right? Well, you know, why have we come to this reading of yours? Well, in part because we want to see an Indian poet being Indian and writing about Indian things, right? Or Kathy Park Hong's recent book, Minor Feelings, is actually like an excellent exploration of this and other aspects of Asian American identity, especially, you know, this, that, for example, what, you know, the narrative of immigration that's most popular in publishing is one of this kind of, you know, going through tragedy and rising above, and look at all of these terrible things that have happened to, you know, this outsider like me, but I've come here and I've survived, and blah, blah, blah. And there's a strong preference for that kind of immigrant narrative, right? And I think there can almost be a kind of self-satisfaction people feel in wanting that kind of narrative. Like, oh, I so want to hear your immigrant story of loss and tragedy and overcoming and so on. And in fact, if I don't hear that kind of story from you, and if you don't perform it for me, I'm going to feel disappointed, right? And sort of, and maybe feel like, well, are you even a real Indian? You know, what exactly are you? So and I think it's not so much that there's something that's clearly fake and clearly real, but that there's a spectrum of what feels right or innate to you in different moments, and what you have to perform for other people, and what you even sort of perform for yourself. You know, I think part of the question of likeness is, how like myself am I? Right? Like, how like the version of myself that I've constructed as an I, as a coherent being, am I even?
This is why we like you, Kanika.
Because I talk a lot.
No, because you're so brilliant.
We're here. I'm here. The talk is here, and you just go like.
No, that's not
here,
true at
and
all.
it begins. It's
no,
wild.
no.
No, it really is.
I love listening to you.
I appreciate that, but it really, like, it's, I don't know if Jerry, Anna, I don't know if you guys did this on purpose, but like the two, you know, our two, again, like you talking about like this narrative, like the narratives and the stories, and like the way we've decided to emphasize what we emphasize is like, it's so interesting the way it juxtaposed, and it's so, I want to know if you guys planned that, or if you guys thought that was going to happen, or if that was random, because I do think it was like pretty, it was pretty fascinating, right?
Just nod, say yes. We totally planned that.
100%.
No, but what's weird is this always happens. We never plan it, except for we try to pick people who are not in the same field.
Uh-huh.
But it always happens. It's really weird what juxtaposition can do.
Yeah, no, it's excellent, and like there exist so many layers of, like, the reality is like the immigrant, again, like the immigrant story, and like how much we believe it ourselves, and how much we want to like make that narrative about, like, you know, to your point, Kanika, like people talk a lot about, they get the tragedy, right, of the immigrant story and how much we have to overcome, but like, hey, guess what, like there are plenty of, like, you know, people that were born inside the United States in Appalachia, or, you know, in the Midwest, or wherever, like, you know, inner city neighborhoods that like had just as much, if not more, tragedy, right? If you want to like measure this weird, horrible, tragic scale, right? Like these people also had hard lives here, and it's weird that like the ticket to like your immigrant story has to include some sort of, disclaimer of like, this is the hardship that we've faced, and this is how we overcome it, and this is why we are deserving of this spot in, you know, this school or this job or this country or whatever. But the reality is like, we're not more or less deserving because we like fought hard for it, because there's people here that fought, you know, there's people that were here longer than we've been here, right? Certainly that have fought here and gotten that stuff, and there's certainly obviously people here that have tried that and failed, and it's a weird like success paradigm that doesn't equate to deservedness or effort, or it's so much more about like demographics, and it's so much more random than it really than it sounds when people, again, try and tell their story, or the story of others too.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I found really difficult about sort of the, you know, process of like applying for visas and so on, and especially for the one I have right now, is that, you know, I have to engage in my application in this rhetoric of, well, I'm so wonderful because I won this award and I published here, and this famous person thinks I'm wonderful, and that means that I have something to contribute to the US and should be allowed to be here. You know, and that is sometimes explicitly, but certainly in many ways implicitly, positioning yourself against all the people who can't say that, right? Like, it's like, I'm better than all of those other people. Let me in. Let me stay here. And that actually really beats you down. Like, it's just having to fill out all these applications in which you're basically arguing for your worth over other people, and your worth based on these metrics that you really don't care about. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I was going to interrupt you, and I'm glad I didn't. But like, yeah, it's and the fact is that like, you as an individual, like, yes, you could help, you know, big picture, like the nation, right, and whatever. But the reality is that like, it's not really about the individual. It's about like immigration, bottom line, like people that are different coming into this country help this country, even if they have no, like you mentioned earlier in your talk, like they have no measurable skills or quantifiable, you know, data-driven solutions to how they're going to monetarily contribute to society. Like, these people are still good for society, right? On scale, and like it feels like it just gets lost in like stories like yours. Again, like there's certainly plenty of talented, engaging, thoughtful people that can answer those questions, right? As like exhausting as that must be, but like the people that can't, like, they're still good for this country. They're still good for the communities that they're going to join. They're still going to make them better writ large, right?
Well, and also what's good for them, right? I mean, this perspective of, I mean, obviously, yes, like the immigration system is for the most part, not only, but for the most part going to consider how does this benefit the US, but, you know, those aren't, the terms of our conversation more broadly about that don't have to be dictated about what a nation state decides is important, right? And that, you know, we have responsibilities to people because they're people, you know, and because if somebody, for example, is, you know, is fleeing the effects of climate change, war, impoverished economies due to the legacy of colonialism and corporate colonialism, we also need to be thinking about, you know, what does coming here do for them, for their families back home, for those countries as a whole? And you know, and do we want to be involved in that, or do we only want to be thinking in terms of, well, how do we benefit if these people come here?
There's I don't know, do you know who Matt Iglesias is?
Yeah, the 1 billion Americans.
Okay, yeah. I'm curious, like, I don't think that book has come out yet, but I'm like a big fan of his podcast. I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on, like, his general, I guess, like, thesis. I don't know how much you've, like, dug into it.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know yet if the book is out or coming out soon. I've listened to a couple of conversations he's had, like, on podcasts with other people about his ideas in the book. So, like, I don't have a full grasp on what his, you know, as I understand it, like, he doesn't spend that much time on the proposal, like, just on the idea that we should let in, you know, we should have 1 billion Americans by letting in a lot more people, right? That he sort of briefly lays that out, but that the most of the book is about how would you make that work? And, you know, in terms of various policies, housing, healthcare, all of those kinds of things. Because of course, the first objection is going to be, well, we just cannot accommodate that many people.
Although the reality is that we can, because America is not a dense country at all. Like, if you look at it, like, there's room for 1 billion Americans, right? Like, theoretically.
But I think the one problem that I do have with how he frames it, again, based on his conversations, is that, well, we should do that because it would be good for American power, right? And would allow us to be a counterweight to China, which is not something to be completely ignored. But I have a problem with thinking of that kind of expansion of the population primarily in terms of American power or American hegemony in the world, right? That even if ultimately that way of thinking about it, you know, I mean, someone might say, well, who cares how you're thinking about it if you're doing it, if you're allowing, you know, another 500 million people or more to come into the country, that'll ultimately be a good thing, even if the reasons you're doing it are, you know, for securing or expanding American power. I think, I'm not entirely sure that's true, but also the kind of rhetoric that would grow around that, well, we need to do this so that we can, you know, hold on to our place in the world as a superpower and as a counterweight to China. I think talking about it in those terms in itself is harmful, or at least only in those terms.
So I agree with you for the most part. I think I do think having a conversation about, like, how we can maintain our superpower status is kind of silly in a world where, in my opinion, like, demographics is king. Like, demographics will determine how much power you have, and you can't really, like, you can do all you want to like fight against it, but like that's what's going to happen. And it's much more about how to like establish like viable future like relationships with these people. So like, again, like China, fine, like China is going to grow regardless of what we do, right? Like we can sit here and talk about how to counter China, which we do, and how to like balance against China, which we, you know, try to do all the time, and that's one thing. But yeah, the reality is like you can't stop that from happening. So why are we going to sit here and spin our wheels trying to talk about how to maintain our edge against you know, against a nation that, I mean, has the resources and has the influence that China does. If there's a reallocation of priorities, right, and we can stop thinking about us in terms of like the racking and stacking of national power, and instead, you know, pick different metrics, I think that would be helpful. But the reality is like I don't know how realistic that is in the even like middle term, you know.
Yeah, but I think we sort of have to try to imagine forms of relationships between nations that are not driven primarily by what a couple of superpowers do, right? If the sort of the assumption is, well, you know, I mean, this is the only model that exists, and if we, you know, if we want the best for our country and our people, then the only way to do that is to try to maintain our hold on power in the world, and to sort of be at, as you said, sort of the, you know, the top of that ranking and stacking. Then that doesn't create an opportunity for us to sort of be like, well, are there other ways of, you know, relating to each other, even as nation states, right? Do we have to? Can we only be thinking in terms of, do I or do I not have more more economic and military power than you? And if I do, what does that allow me to do, or what does that allow me to get away with?
I have so many thoughts on this, and I literally, I'm looking at my clock and watch, thinking like we're gonna be here until like midnight, because like this is fascinating. I'd like to probably like get your contact information so I can ask you some more questions about how you feel about this.
Yeah, I think we should let Jerry and Anna go and eat their dinner, and
absolutely.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Cool. Yeah, I'll shoot you an email just so you have it, and I'd love to just continue this discussion.
Sorry for eating.
To listen to.
Yeah, it was great dinner talk.
Yeah.
I just had physical needs that needed to be taken care of.
All right.
You guys are so great. This is really brilliant and wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to share the space.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. This is the kind of space that I wish like existed more. Again, down here, like in my little circle of people that are kind of insular and cornered off. And so I appreciate you guys doing what you can to not do that, right? To do the opposite of that and poke out and find different people and have interesting, important conversations. And it's such a cool medium. So I really appreciate the opportunity, guys.